I think Alberto in his presentation has really answered very clearly and comprehensively the question as to why human beings accomplish. Why we accomplish is because there's an innate drive for accomplishment as an expression of a drive towards self-actualization. He's also answered the question in very profound terms as to what are the basic conditions which promote human accomplishment, are most conducive to human accomplishment. So in this presentation, I'd like to start a discussion as to not why we accomplish, which he's done, but why we accomplish at different levels or in different ways or in different fields than we do. If this is a common drive to all human beings, what makes the difference in the way we accomplish in different walks of, different people accomplish in different walks of life? I think many of you will be familiar with the Indian allegory about the 6 blind men and the elephant. 6 blind men approached an elephant, and each of them found a different part of it and were feeling it and describing it. And they each described one the trunk, one the body, one the leg, one the ear, one the tail. And they each were describing what they had discovered to the others and were describing completely different phenomena. Often, when we read theories of personality, I get that feeling that different people are holding different parts of the animal and describing it to us. So I'd like to explore some of those parts this afternoon. Before that, I'd like to start with a story that had made a deep impression on me for a number of reasons. And it's a story that took place during the Great Depression in 1933 in the United States. Of course, the Great Crash came in 29, and after 29, the economy began to sink. And by March 1933, there was 25% unemployment in the U.S., which was a phenomenally high. In fact, it was the highest rate ever achieved up until then, because this is a country where labor was always in short supply. We never heard of unemployment of any significance. The agricultural economy was in ruins. Farm prices had fallen so low. Industrial production was down by 50%. And most relevant for my story is that there was a panic in the banking system. Banks started to close, and once banks started to close, people panicked and started rushing to the banks to withdraw their money in fear that their bank might close. And as a natural self-fulfilling prophecy, which I think we were mentioning before, and you take the soundest bank in the world, and if everybody starts going to the bank to withdraw their money, it's guaranteed to fail, because every bank thrives and functions only by lending out the money that they've got deposited, in fact, many times over. So there's no way that any bank can repay all the money of depositors in the short term. And of course, the moment the banks started to call back loans in order to safeguard themselves, businesses started to close, trade fell, employment fell, and it was a vicious cycle. By March 1933, 6,000 banks in the United States had closed. That was about 25% of the banks in the entire country. And that was the time that a man named Franklin Delano Roosevelt assumed the presidency of the United States. Quite the contrary to Abraham Lincoln, Roosevelt came from, if we have an aristocracy in America, he came from the aristocracy. He came from the wealthy families, originally from Holland, many a century before. He was a distant relative of Teddy Roosevelt, who had been president before him. And Roosevelt came at the most critical time in the history of the United States, which had by then had a huge economy, and suddenly we reached the point where nobody knew what to do to bring this around. For 3 years, President Hoover had followed all the advice of the economists to try to save things, and it seemed to only make it worse, and the panic was getting worse. And when FDR was inaugurated as president, in his inaugural speech, he spoke some words which we became very famous and immortalized. He said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." He recognized that the fundamental problem for the U.S. economy was not anything physical, was not anything economic, but it was something really psychological. And according to, if this fear remains, things will continue to get worse. So he declared, the first thing he did was he declared a national banking holiday. And then on the 5th day of being in office, he got on the radio. Radio was still a very new thing at that time. He got on the radio and addressed the nation in the first of what became known as his fireside chats. And he said to the American people, and millions listened to him, he said, all the great, rich natural resources that made us the most prosperous country in the world are still there. All the factories and industrial infrastructure that made us 1/3 of the world economy are still there. All the talents and skills and capacities of our people that have made us so prosperous are still there. Then what have we lost? What is different? We have lost trust in ourselves. We have lost trust in our system. At a time when no economist had an answer to this, there was no economic policy that could stop this panic. And he said, Monday morning, I'm going to open the banks again. I've closed the banks for a week. Monday morning, I'm going to open the banks. I closed the banks because last week you were all lined up at the banks trying to take out the money, and that's the surest way to ruin the system. Next Monday, I'm going to open the banks. And I am asking you to go back to the banks. I'm asking you to line up at the banks again, but I'm asking you to go and redeposit your money in the banks. It's not a strategy that any economist in his right mind could ever think of, and I think very few politicians would have had the courage to do it. And that's what he did. He opened the banks, and Monday morning, sure enough, the lines formed at the banks, and every bank was in an utter panic because they didn't know. Some people came to deposit, some people came to withdraw, and nobody knew which way it was going to go. And of course, somebody may come with the idea of depositing, and when he sees somebody else coming away with his cash, he changes his mind and decides to take out the rest of what he has. And within 3 or 4 days, the panic was completely stopped, and the banking system was saved by a man who understood the psychology of the nation and understood that even what we consider our most hard science, our most hard social science, which after all is based on something so concrete as money, is really not based on something concrete at all. It's something based on human trust. It's based on confidence. It's based on human emotions. It's based on human character. He understood the psychological character of our economic system, the psychological fundamentals of that economic system. And what followed that was really quite extraordinary, because in the next few years, he introduced regulation of the banking system, which had never been there in any measure up until then, a regulation that was in effect for 70 years up until about 10 years ago when the banks convinced the government that it was time to deregulate because of international competition, leading to 2008. Between 1933 and 2008, the U.S. never had a banking crisis because of the regulation that was put in at that time. He introduced labor legislation in the most capitalist, anti-labor of all countries, insisted on economic rights for labor. In fact, if he had lived until the end of World War II, he was planning to introduce a second Bill of Rights, and a Bill of Economic Rights, in which the first right would be the right to employment. Unfortunately, he didn't live to the end of the war. He introduced the first social welfare legislation, what we call the New Deal or the welfare state, which changed the character of the country and its government and the responsibility of government, and it's still in force today. He introduced a massive program for conservation of nature. He laid the foundations for the peace in Europe and the founding of the UN. And he was a chief force, though America didn't have any colonies at that time. He exerted heavy pressure on Britain particularly and on France to commit themselves that once the war is over, that they would totally dismantle their colonies. So he had a force in moving towards the abolition of colonialism throughout the world. This is another example of a person one person who had a remarkable impact. Now you can say, well, after all, he was President of the United States. But the guy who preceded him, Herbert Hoover, was also President of the United States, and during his time, only things got worse. And we've had many presidents. We just had one. In fact, we know being President of the United States means you're powerful, but it doesn't mean you're powerful to do good. You can easily do the very opposite of that. And this was a situation in which nobody thought that the president has the power in order to do it. It wasn't the president's position that gave him the power. It was something in his personality, his understanding, and his knowledge as an individual that gave him the power. And you can believe there was tremendous opposition to what he did. And tremendous amount of advice, expert advice, that was telling him, don't do this, it'll be a total disaster. We've only lost 6,000 banks. Next Monday we're going to lose the other 18,000 if you follow this harebrained scheme. But he stuck to his resolve. This is an example of individuality. So now let's look at the range of what we've been talking about. When we talk about human personality, we really see it has three kind of fields or zones to it. There's something about us as human beings in which we're all the same. In fact, that's what we mean when we talk about human nature. When we talk about human nature, we're talking about that in human beings which we all share. Just as we all share a biological nature, we all share certain characteristics. Maybe you have some of them more than I do or less than somebody else, but we all have them. We are all capable of fear. We all have desires. We all have curiosity in one way or another, whether it's curiosity for the rumors about and gossip about other people, or curiosity about the Big Bang and the origin of the universe. Curiosity is native to human beings. We all have doubts. We all have egoism in one form, pride and self-importance in one form or another, selfishness in one. Even the most selfless of people will have something on which selfishness is there in our bones and blood. We all are impatient in certain things. We all resist change in certain areas. Not everybody can go to the new fashions like Alberto can and learn to appreciate them. Shows how young at heart he is. Keeps moving with the generation. Some people are fixed from the time of their youth and can never accept a change in hairstyle or a change in the length of the pants or the thickness of the tie from that time onward. But whether it's our ideas stay the same or our habits stay the same or the way we comb our hair or whatever it is, we all have certain things in which we're fixed. And that's what we call human nature. We all share certain characteristics or in different measure, similar. We're similar to each other in many respects, though different. We have similarities of need. Maslow talks about a hierarchy of needs. My need for safety or my need for social support or self-esteem may be different than somebody else's. But there's something similar about those, even though we express differently. We have different character traits, and there are theories of psychology that describe human beings in terms of constellations of character traits. We have typologies of people. People who share this constellation of character traits belong to a particular type. They're each different. None of that doesn't mean we're all the same, but kind of like in the astrological section, these are a group of characteristics that people share. And then we all have certain characteristics that make us unique, that make us different, not just different from every other person in either very minor or sometimes very significant ways. And somehow what we call personality is a composite of these three spheres or these three characteristics. In terms of our uniqueness, it's very interesting that even at the level of physical nature, we each have a unique fingerprint. Isn't that really remarkable? 7 billion people, and nature never does it the same way. It's really, if that's true of something so tangible as the physical, after all, fingers don't vary that much. The patterns, but yet each one is unique. Facial features. Isn't it remarkable that with so many people walking around on the planet that we all manage to look somewhat different? It's true. Occasionally you feel somebody, if you don't see them together, you feel that they're very similar. But even among those who are, even among identical twins, those who know the twins can tell them apart. Because the facial features, even if they were physically almost identical, the personality is not identical. And the personality that expresses through those features, it can be identified by those who know them. That uniqueness has been immortalized by great authors like Shakespeare, who talked about Cleopatra. The infinite variety of her charms. Shakespearean characters are wonderful because with all the characters in his 37 plays, you'll never find two characters that are identical. Anthony Trollope, the English author who wrote about 150 years ago, he wrote about 45 novels. He's got at least 500 or 600, maybe it's 1,000 characters in his stories. Trollope, I think, is a very good author, but he doesn't compare with Shakespeare. And yet, there are no two characters. I've read all of his novels. There's no two characters that are the same. Each one has their own uniqueness. They share lots of common characteristics. You can compare them and say, oh, well, these two are of this type and these two are of that type. But they each have their uniqueness. So there's something about this thing we call personality that combines sameness, similarity, and uniqueness. So what is this thing? And what is it that constitutes our personality? We've already talked about, I think, almost all of these elements in one place or another. And I've just tried to list them here, not in any hierarchy at all, though they may be grouped. Every human being, Alberto was talking about our aspirations, our ideals, our values. Every human being has opinions, beliefs, attitudes, feelings, emotions, sentiments, needs, desires, motives, urges, impulses. We all have memories that drive us and define our identity, and imagination and of the future. At the physical level, we have habits and skills, abilities, and physical traits. These are all just elements. This is, if you were to take a reductionist view of the human personality, you might say, well, we're nothing but a big bag full of these assorted elements. But it really doesn't tell us very much. At the other end, we've just heard about Carl Rogers' vision about a centralizing, organizing tendency which takes this grab bag of elements and organizes it towards specific goals. Well, now I'm talking about different views of the elephant from different perspectives. One of the ways we can look at the elephant, and these are not mutually exclusive ways, they're different perspectives of the same reality. One of the ways we can look at the elephant of human personality is to say, well, there are physical attributes of our personality. There are emotional attributes. Mila was just talking about the fact that the heart knows, it has its own intelligence, it has its own ways of knowing. There are mental attributes of human personality. And what you could call psychological or spiritual, depending on your inclination and depending on the context. We have aspirations, we have ideals, we seek for perfection in one way or another, whether it's self-actualization or excellence. So one way we can look at the differences in human personality is that we are different not only physically in terms of our appearance, we're different in terms of our physical sensitivities. Steve Jobs had an incredible physical sensitivity. No, I don't like the way this iPod feels in my hand. No, the design of this screen, there's a story in his biography about when he was designing the first calculator utility to go in the Macintosh. He was driving the designers crazy because he said, I don't like the way that calculator looks on the screen. And he made him redesign the calculator 10 times, and finally the engineer designed a calculator which he could customize to make it look the way he wanted. And Jobs spent a few hours customizing the calculator. That's the way it should look. He just had that physical sensitivity to what, how things should be. Obviously, we have a wide range of emotional sensitivities and feelings, sentiments that vary. Mentally, we can talk about, we have ethical, there's an ethical element to our mentality, there's an aesthetic element to our mentality, there's a rational element to our mentality. So, one way we can, I'm calling this levels of consciousness from physical to emotional to mental to spiritual or psychological, whichever term you want to use, as one way we can look at the variety and differences in human personality. This morning, Janani talked about another way we can do it. Instead of thinking of it in terms of levels, we can think of it in terms of layers. And she talked about the most external layer of what the world sees outside as our manners. And then she talked about conscious behaviors. She gave the example of Jane Bennett, who you'll see in a few minutes, who really believes everything she says, whereas we know that many times people don't, their manners don't reflect their convictions. If somebody serves me, if somebody invites me into their home and serves me their best meal and says, how did you like it? Chances are I'm going to say it was excellent, even if I was disappointed, because more important to me is that they should be happy and not offended, then I should speak out the truth. So we know those differences can be there between what we do outside, what we express outside, and really what we believe, and then they're between what we think we believe and what we really emotionally endorse. And you saw the proposal of Darcy to Elizabeth in the quick film, which you'll see again, in which Darcy has decided to come. He's made a thoughtful commitment and decided he really wants to marry this girl. He comes and proposes to her, and even in the act of proposing to her, he can't resist telling her all the reasons why he thinks it's a bad idea. Because his heart says one thing and his mind says something else. So these two different layers can be at cross purposes with each other. So anyway, another way to look at our personality is as an onion skin, going from outside to inside, and the deeper we go, the deeper it is, the less accessible it is not only to other people, but even to ourselves, to know really what we are inside. As Alberto said this morning, to be really in touch with your deepest feelings is not a gift or a knowledge open to many of us. So what can we say from this? I mentioned yesterday that we can look at society and think of it as an organization. We can also look at human personality as an organization of these constituent pieces. That's the reductionist approach, of different levels, of different layers, all arranged in relation to one another. And one of the questions is, what is that relationship? And how are they arranged? So if we think about personality as the organization of the psychological elements, and this personality interconnects the parts, it coordinates the different elements, and it integrates, I say here, partially integrates the different dimensions, functions, attributes, levels, and layers together. Why partially? I gave the example of Darcy. One of the reasons I like that scene so much is because here's a fairly mature man, though he didn't seem it very much in that scene, whose mind and emotions are not integrated with each other. And that's not an uncommon phenomenon. The most famous piece of literature in the English language, Hamlet, is really the story about a man who's unable to integrate his mental sense of duty towards his father and his emotions. His father, who's been murdered by his uncle, the ghost comes to him and says, go and revenge against your uncle. But Hamlet knows that the real source of his father's death is his mother was unfaithful. His mother gave the uncle enough encouragement to know that if he's out of the way, that Claudius can become the king. Hamlet feels it's the mother who is responsible, and he wants to go and take revenge against her. The ghost is telling him go after the father, and he's got this neurotic complex on his hands. We have a common phrase that we say one thing and do another. We say one thing and do another. I think parents, it's a typical phenomenon. Parents tell children do this, but they do something else because at two levels of their own personality, they're not integrated. So if there is certainly integration in the human personality, but maybe one of the definitions of a fully functional person or an evolved, individuated person is somebody with a high degree of integration. But I would think, my own sense of it is, that integration is something that happens over time and happens with maturity. And in most human beings, the disconnect of these elements can be as prominent as the connections are as well. There are lots of gaps and inconsistencies, and that's why we see even the idealist who preaches certain ways, acts in ways that are contrary to his own things that he preaches, because there's the lack of integration. So another way to look at this is that organization is a complex the personality is a complex organization. This is not any simple thing that we can model in 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions and think we have really got it. It's not simply a mechanical assembly. There are elements of our personality which seem to resemble a mechanical assembly. There are psychological theories like the behavior of stimulus and response. If you poke here, you get that reflex reaction, which seems to suggest that there's a linearity in human behavior. It's one aspect, but it's not the whole thing. We do have onion layers from the surface to the depths. It tells something about us, but it doesn't give the truth of the whole of what a human being is. We do have multiple levels. We can't be simply reduced, as many of the physiologists would like to do, and try to explain all our human behavior in terms of pharmacology or even neurology. They find correspondences between hormones or neural action and certain human behaviors, but we're a very, very long way of trying to, of having evidence to document the fact that all aspects of human behavior can be explained in terms of hormonal or neurological response. At least science is very far away from doing it. So we have multiple layers. What are their relationships with one another? They're very complex, and we know relatively little about them still. We know there are relationships. We know the placebo effect, which Alberto was talking about. We know the mind's attitude can affect the emotions, can affect the physiology, and vice versa. So in one sense, we are not simply like a fruit, an orange, where you can peel us into separate pieces. Some of the typologies want to fit us into some compartments and say you're either an introvert or an extrovert or thinking or feeling. There are truths in all of that. There are tendencies in all of that. But we can't separate ourselves into separate fruits. We're something more complex, more interconnected, more organic than any of these conceptions. And when it comes to the growth of personality, we have the same issue. Our tendency is to think about growth as a linear process. Growth physically, even our physical growth is not linear. We don't just grow taller. We grow taller, we go broader, but in fact we're growing proportionately in every dimension. Every organ of our body is growing simultaneously. The bones are getting thicker and heavier and stronger, as well as getting longer. Everything, the nerves, the circulatory system, everything is growing in a multi-dimensional way, even at the physical level. And that's true psychologically as well. When a child is growing, their skills are growing. Their attitudes are changing. Their values are growing. Their knowledge is growing. So it's a multi-dimensional process, and to me it's an awesome, wondrous process, which our highest conceptions in science or even in literature don't come close to approximating the wonder of what this human phenomenon is. Maybe that's why we need poetry so much and art to express what the thinking mind can't express. We know our growth is also not just a growth of each element, of each individual endowment. Person grows in empathy, or in goodwill, or in patience, or in strength, or in skill. But our growth takes place in terms of the combinations and the coordination between these different capabilities. The thing that made FDR successful in his effort of going on the radio, he was a tremendous communicator. He was known to be a tremendous communicator. But it wasn't just that. He had an insight. Where he got it, I don't know. Never read. He had an insight into the interplay between the economy and the society and the psychology of the people, which was really profound, which you rarely find in economic science. And he had something else too. He had a charm. There's a wonderful story about that charm. When FDR was going to meet Churchill the first time during the war, Churchill flew over from England asking for support from the Americans before America entered the war. And FDR was warned that whatever you do, don't mention the name of Nehru. Nehru was one of the leaders of the Indian freedom movement, and Churchill was an avid he said, his famous words were, "I will never preside over the dissolution of Her Majesty's empire." And India was the jewel in the crown of the empire. So he was firmly committed to opposing Indian independence. He always had been until just before the end. And so whatever you do, don't mention the name of Nehru in Churchill's presence. FDR was advised by his counselors. And so when he was talking to Churchill at a dinner party and somebody came up to FDR in the middle and said, "Mr. President, what do you think of Jawaharlal Nehru?" And suddenly Churchill was freezing like this, and everybody around was freezing like this, and FDR paused for a minute and he said, "Who's Nehru?" Churchill listened to that, and immediately he understood, and he smiled broadly and was totally satisfied. He was charmed, and it was as much as charm as anything else that won the support of the people for this. So our capacities don't just develop in a linear way, they develop in constellations, they develop in relation to one another. They develop in complex fabrics and networks. And if you look at, that's why we have a difficulty when you see somebody like Lincoln has accomplished. You look at the different characteristics that enabled him to accomplish. One of the things I mentioned yesterday was that his complete absence of resentment. A very rare characteristic. I mean, these were people who tried to stab him in the back, and the next day he'll sit down with them and talk politely with them. He says, "I don't have time to settle past dues. If I can deal with a man for today, I will do it." Not that he was an unprincipled. He was unegoistic. So you see these remarkable combinations of characteristics that make possible human accomplishment. And in some way, they are all integrated together. So words being inadequate and me being far from poetic, I think of growth of personality as organic. We're not talking about a machine here. Multidimensional. Spherical. Spherical not as a literal shape, but spherical in the sense that it is development in multiple directions at the same time. Complexity. So, personality is a complex, conscious, living organism. It's not just an organization. It's a living organization. It's an organism. It's capable of growing from every experience, both its positive experiences and has come out in several of the interesting discussion, as much or more even from its negative experiences. As Alberto said, and it's my favorite line in his presentation, which I like so much anyway, for many reasons, it's unlimited in its potential for development. It's infinite in its variety and its qualities. I believe it's unknowable in its totality and its uniqueness. One of the things that will come out when you see Pride and Prejudice is that one of the wonders in this story is Darcy never knows how Elizabeth is going to respond the next time. He never is able to figure out what makes her what she is. He can never predict. She remains a mystery to him. And I can't speak on behalf of womanhood, but I know for many, many men in the world that they feel from beginning to end that woman remains a mystery and they can never be sure what's coming next. We are a mystery, sometimes to ourselves and definitely to others. And we're perpetually evolving in consciousness and evolving in organization. How does this relate to accomplishment? Personality supplies the driving force, the direction, and the subtle organization, the inner organization for all human accomplishment. And that raises a question which I raised on the first morning. In fact, it was the first question in my list that I raised, and that is, what is the fuel for human accomplishment? What is it that drives human accomplishment? And in studying the lives of people who achieve at a high level, what do we see about that? And I did extensive research on high achievement in the field of business first, and after that extended it to the field of political achievement and artistic and literary achievement. We've done a lot of research. And this was, to me, the single most striking attribute of high-achieving individuals was the intensity of the energy that they exhibit. And it's the intensity of the energy that they exhibit. And I've got some examples for you. Theodore Roosevelt, who was president 3 presidents before FDR, a relative, he was known for his exuberant personality, his robust masculinity. He was known as the trustbuster because he broke up Standard Oil. And I've given a couple of quotes here. He said, this was by an Englishman who met Theodore Roosevelt for the first time, said, do you know the 2 most wondrous things I have seen in your country? Niagara Falls and the President of the United States, both great wonders of nature. And another person meeting him for the first time described him as a perpetual flow of torrential energy, a sense of motion even in stillness, thrilling to be near. And this characteristic, if you go through and read biographies of high achievers in any field, you'll be amazed how often this word, it's not a word typically used in psychology. It's not a psychological construct, but you'll be amazed at how often this word comes. Balzac was a remarkable artist, a writer. In one period of just 2 years, he created 150 short novels, stories, articles, and commentaries. I think it's a feat. It's an unparalleled feat in world literature. And over the next 20 years, 40 full-length novels. One of the descriptions of Balzac was, everything he did seemed to have a tenfold intensity. When he laughed, the pictures on the walls trembled. When he spoke, the words came cascading forth. When he worked, there was no difference between day and night as he sat writing round the clock and blunted a dozen pens in the process. Edison was the one who was famous for that quote that genius is 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. He patented 1,100 inventions during his lifetime. He gave birth to entirely new industries, the motion picture, photograph, recording, electrical, and household appliance industries. He founded a company that even today, more than 100 years later, is the 7th largest corporation in the world, General Electric. One of the comments, he was approached by a publisher when he was 60 and asked to write an autobiography so they could publish it. And his comment was, when I go into senile decay, I may consider an autobiographical scheme, but as long as I can put in 18 hours daily, I don't want to waste any time on it. He used to sleep in his workshop on the desk because he didn't want to take the time to go into a bed and come back. Just incredible energy. I interviewed this man, Will Marriott, in 1984 when his son was in the process of taking over the Marriott Corporation. And this is how he was described. His managers never knew what time of day or night he'd show up at the kitchen door and go bird dogging almost at a half run through the kitchen, the pantries, the storage rooms, the refrigerators, the restaurant itself, running a finger over the shelves to check for dust, checking under the tables in the cutlery drawers, checking the ranges, the storage rooms, the trays about to be served, sampling root beer and raising hell if everything wasn't spotless, neat, clean, bright, polished, done efficiently, done well. Each of them has a different characteristic. Marriott's was a physical drive for perfection. Balzac was a creative energy. Edison was a technical imagination. But they all exhibited this intensity, remarkable intensity. There's a quote about quotes you can. I read a biography of Kissinger in which he describes meeting Chairman Mao for the first time. And his first description of the man was, when you walked in the room, the first impression was a tremendous intensity. Once, 1980, I met with Indira Gandhi when she was Prime Minister, and she was a woman who just exuded that energy. I don't mean when she's talking or running around or anything. I mean just sitting, standing there. You could feel the intensity and strength of her personality. So it doesn't matter what field, whether it's politics or business or anything. And what in mid-'80s, we did research into 20 of the most successful companies in the United States at that time, and one of them happened to be Apple. And when we went into Apple, you could literally feel the intensity of the energy in the atmosphere. I don't just mean because people were running around in an excited way. You could literally feel the energy. We went into Intel. And the first interview we had at Intel was the chief financial officer. And the first question I asked him was, what is it that makes the difference here? What has made Intel so extraordinary? And the first word out of his mouth was, it's the energy. We've got the energy here. And in these companies, they were all companies we've gone into and met with people. I've described it because each of them, the energy they had was of a different type. In Merck, it was more like a Mercedes engine. There was not of that exuberance of, floating around. You just felt this is a perfect, well-oiled machine where nothing is out of place. Everybody's quiet, but it's a tremendous intensity. Northwestern Mutual, where Janani was narrating that incident yesterday about the brain-damaged customer and all. It's known as the quiet company. And yet, year after year, decade after decade, they have the highest performance statistics in the industry. They're not the biggest, but they have the highest performance statistics in the industry. They do things very quietly, but they just don't miss a beat. They're channeling that energy so efficiently. So energy is not just a characteristic of individuals, it's also a characteristic of organizations. And I think we also know it's a characteristic of societies. When Alexis de Tocqueville was sent from France in the 1830s to the U.S., he was sent to inspect the American penal system because the U.S. had done some progressive things in dealing with prisoners, and he never dreamed. He was just blown away by the energy of the society and the amount of freedom he had never seen before. Janani, in her opening narrative in her first speech about Around the World in 80 Days, communicated Jules Verne's, another Frenchman's view of America. and how this uncontainable energy. Charles Gaulle was never known to be a very great admirer of America, but on his first visit to America, he couldn't help expressing, when he got to New York, the tremendous intensity that he felt there, which shocked him. Today, we see that intensity in many places, especially in Asia. We see the awakening of that energy. I see it in the Indian cities. It was not there 30, 40 years ago, but it's been released today. You see it in Hong Kong and Shanghai and in many of the Asian countries. So this is a capacity of human beings which under certain circumstances gets released and rises to high intensity. But there are different types of energy. We know there's the energy of the physically active, extraordinary person, like a great basketball player, Michael Jordan, or Genghis Khan, who's a phenomenal story of how from one small family he united the entire Mongol nation and conquered more territory than Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great, with an incredible physical energy, physical drive in those people. They had unstoppable energy. Nobody could keep up with them. Their drive was so great. Emotional energy, the capacity of a political leader, typically Martin Luther King, if you listen to some of his speeches, you see how he just exudes that energy. Gandhi used to draw even up to 1 million people in the crowds, and they would just be mesmerized by the energy that he communicated. Entrepreneurs I've already talked about. Mental energy, a Socrates. It's of a different type, but of what an intensity. In literature, I like the example of Sherlock Holmes very much, because even if you don't take the most modern versions of the movies, if you go back to the story, he's so filled with mental intensity that if he doesn't have a problem to solve, he's going and taking some drugs because he can't handle the intensity. He has to find an outlet for it. So it's in the genius of any description. It's in the great artists. And spiritually, the description of great spiritual leaders from all over the world, those who have been in their presence, are just awestruck by the vibration, the intensity of the vibrations they communicate. So energy is, to me, one of the fundamental of determining what a person accomplishes. It's an intangible. I'm not talking about the physical energy of the body. I don't think it has. This can be in a very small person. It can be in a thin person. It's not measured by physical size or how much a person eats. It's a psychological energy, which Alberto was referring to when he talked about the sources of that energy. In one of his last slides, the sources of energy for accomplishment. And he said one of them was the sense of purpose. I thought that was really a very profound insight. That a sense of purpose generates energy. The word I use for it, another word for it is aspiration. The intensity of the energy of a personality depends on the aspiration of the person. If my aspiration is simply, I want security, I want comfort, I don't want anybody to bother me, and when those needs are met, I'm not going to be exuding a lot of energy. But if my ambition is to displace IBM and convert the machine from a threat into an empowering tool for humanity, I'm taking on the whole world. The way Lincoln took on the goal of abolishing slavery, or FDR took on the goal of a banking crisis. So people vary in the aspirations they have and the commitments they make, the responsibilities they take on, and the intensity of that aspiration determines the intensity of the energy they release. I think of aspiration as a psychological will, a psychological exertion of will. We physically exert ourselves. Psychologically, we also exert ourselves. And when somebody aspires for a high ideal and says they're going to be committed to that, and they really want to achieve it, it can release an enormous amount of energy. It may be in pursuit of joy, it may be for mastery, it may be for self-realization, it may be for a high ideal of self-sacrifice. But those people who release the high energy do it through an aspiration. And I always like to remind myself of the distinction between aspiration and satisfaction, because we all tend to seek a satisfaction. But the proportion in which we get satisfied, the energy tends to go down. It gets absorbed by the satisfaction. So many people start off with a high intensity as youth. And then after they, quote, make it. In fact, back in 2001, I went to Japan. That was in the middle of the Japanese banking crisis, where they had written off billions and billions of dollars. They had been 12 years in the financial slump, and they were unable to find a policy to get out of this slump from 1988, after 1988. The country virtually stopped growing for 12 years, and nobody even explained why. I was interviewed by the editor of the Japan Times, and he invited me to write an article. And I wrote an article. My diagnosis of the problem that Japan had was simply they had over-fulfilled their aspirations. They had started out at the end of World War II completely devastated. They had their only aspiration was to catch up to the West, to catch up to America. And they did it. In 1984 or 1985, a book was published in the U.S. by an American called Japan as Number One. It was a big shock to America. Somebody saying Japan is number one. When I was growing up, if something was made in Japan, it meant it was junk. And that was the definition. You know, if it's made in Japan, oh, sorry, don't touch it. No wonder it fell apart in my hands. By 1985, to say it was made in Japan means it's the best there is. And what happened? A generation only has so high in their aspirations. They achieved their aspiration through remarkable effort. And having achieved it, they were content. And when they were content, they weren't consuming more. They were putting their extra money instead of consuming more. They were already living at such a high standard compared to where they were 20 years earlier. After consuming more and more, they started just investing it in real estate, and they had a huge real estate bubble, and the real estate bubble burst. And there was nothing the government could do through fiscal or monetary policy to get them further. In 1998, we had the East Asian financial crisis, where a similar thing happened financially, the crisis that hit Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and South Korea. And people were saying, oh, it'll take them 10 years to recover. And I said at that time, it's not going to take 10 years to recover, because they haven't fulfilled their aspiration. They're not satisfied. They still want to catch up to Japan. And sure enough, within 6 months, it defied all the predictions of the financial experts. Within 6 months, Korea was back on a growth path again. And the East Asian financial crisis melted away for most of the countries in very short time. So aspiration is a real powerful determinant. I just come back, and I want to wind this up so we can get on. Let me just see where I am. Okay. Well, I won't dwell on this. I just wanted to say, if you look at Steve Jobs' life and look for the sources of his energy, part of it came from the sense of deprivation, that he was an illegitimate child. Part of it came because he had a strong aspiration. Part of it came because he was rebelling against the society. Part of it came out of a passion. He had a passionate love for technology and for making it work and useful. But more than that, he had a passionate love for products. I mean, he really loved music, and he really wanted, he said this, a music player that can only play 10 or carry 12 of your songs around is not worthwhile. And he was dedicated to produce something that could fulfill his own tastes. But he was a man who had that intensity. So, in sum here, if you look at the dimensions of personality, and I don't mean this to be taken literally, I'm trying to be indicative of the complexity that we have. We've been hearing words like values are important, knowledge is important, aspiration is important. As Gianni said, we've got different layers, and you'll see, I hope you'll see this in the film that we're going to watch. And there are different levels, from physical to emotional to mental, that are important. All of these are interacting and getting organized in some way around a self-actualizing principle. What binds them all together? What forms them into something that's not just a grab bag of different, diverse, disparate elements, but into something that's organized around some core driving motives and values? That's what Alberto said, is personality. One of my favorite anecdotes, Napoleon, as he was marching through Germany on one of his campaigns, he called a dinner. He used to invite the elite from different places to come and dine with him. He loved to be with intellectuals and people and all. And he was sitting in a tent around a dinner of some 20 people. And Goethe came and entered the tent. And as he walked, he was a tall man with a long beard, majestic-looking man. Napoleon looked up and saw him. He stood up and he said, "Finally, a man." Seeing him, just seeing him, he said, "This is what a man should look like." He could see the personality. He could see the richness. He could see that indescribable essence that made him a real individual. And that's what we're looking for. There's something of that man or woman in all of us. And that's what self-actualization is all about, to bring that out.
First, thank you for this beautiful picture on the spot. This elephant with 6 person. It's the first time in my life that I saw it. It's really gorgeous. It's really gorgeous. Thank you. And thank you about these short stories. You put always very short stories, and one of these is about Nero. I didn't know that. It's really good one. About diplomatic skills, actually.
What is it? You know, what makes a personality?
Yeah,
what makes it? It's
really good.
And also, thank you very much for the way you present your topics, because you're doing it in a way that you provoke thinking from different notions, and you interconnect different terms like personality, aspiration, and whatever. So we are doing it in a way that forms the general picture first, and then also provokes thinking on different topics. It was with the slide about the personality, I think, where the definition of it was always negation, like it is not that.
It's not an onion skin, it's not a machining, it's not a mechanical assembly.
You have to think, what is this?
Exactly.
Thank you very much.
What also found very interesting is when I look about the different kinds of energy in a personal way, like energy in a spiritual way, and physical way. And when I compare it with the natural energy resources, wind energy, solar energy, and future energy, how somehow is to connect all these energies, different energy forms. And my question is, how is it possible to produce such kind of different personal energy forms and to connect all these energy forms, to have a higher level of energy, which is more than part of the energy in the sun?
That's a really profound question, because if you think about it, if you think about the implications of what you're saying, most of our problem is, and when we have our technological energy, our capacity to invent, unconnected from a rational mental energies planning on what are the consequences of this, our energies can lead to disaster. So for us to integrate the emotional energy, I mean, the example of Darcy I love because he shows his mental energy and his emotional energy are going in different directions. And this is not an uncommon thing, this is a very common thing. And you see the result of it. It causes total problems for him until he goes through a process of transformation. And for me, that's the real inspiration of this story, is to bring them into alignment with one another. And maybe, I haven't thought of it until you raised the question, but maybe that's a way for us to think about the problem of humanity, as to how do we reconcile, the person who loves to drink or smoke because of a physical urge is doing something which the mind knows they shouldn't do. There are many, many different, infinite number of, so the word integration keeps coming back to me. The thing I like so much about Carl Rogers' thought and the other humanists is they didn't get bogged down in this infinite complexity. They saw to the core principle, the core organizing principle behind all of it. And that was, there is a natural urge for that self-actualization, and self-actualization or individuation, which I will use the term tomorrow and talking about the next day about that, is really a process of integrating all of this. When I was talking about society, I was trying to talk about how society gets more and more integrated, we say more and more connected, but that doesn't express the complexity of it. So as an individual, to integrate our physical capacities with our emotional capacities, with our mental and capacities and our spiritual aspirations is really to become a whole, fully functional person. So your question raises, to me, something very profound. And how do we balance them out so that one is not dominating all the others the way we see in the natural environment today, the imbalances between them?
Because, the question isn't because some of our researchers in our institute, he's a very, very tough mathematician, but he is not able to somehow to establish social connections, or is only functioning in a totally mathematical way. For example, if you mean the GDP, but you say money, he directly attacking you and said, no, it's not money, it's the GDP, per capita. And it's very strongly defined by mathematician thinking. In that way, he is perfect. But since 2 years, he's somehow ill, in physical manner. And I'm wondering how these people that you showed us as great leadership, how they are trying to balance their different kinds of energy styles.
Well, many of them couldn't. Many of them, jobs couldn't. My own feeling, and I don't have any medical proof for this, but my own feeling is that his illness, which finally was cancer that led to his death, itself was a reflection of the total imbalances in his personality. He had a fanatical intensity in energy in pursuit of certain things. He did it in his work. He sacrificed family life, personal relations were an abomination. His own health became a victim or an expression of that disharmony. So the principle, we've been using the word humility as a very important word. The word came earlier today of balance, but I prefer balance can sometimes be confused with the idea of a compromise. But the word harmony, to have a harmony between the different parts of our personality, the different drives and aspirations we have, to me, that's really central to the process of self-actualization. To be able to harmonize, some people say you have to have a balance between your personal life and your private life. That means you should have so many days off with the family and so many days there. That's a kind of a simplistic way of looking. There has to be a harmony. That harmony may be your family is your work, or your work is your family, whatever it is. But it's got to be integrated with your personality.
I also think it's not possible to differentiate between work and life, because you stand up because
exactly.
You are working at 6 or at 7, and then you have to say I have to work at 6. So it's trying to separate these both is impossible. And if you try things that are not possible, you will get. By the way, our research guy is also cancer since a couple of years, I think. I never accept him because we are very familiar, but I think that's also the same as the case by jobs.
The moment you think that work and enjoyment and satisfaction are separate from each other, you've got an irretrievable dichotomy there. You have to find the joy and satisfaction in whatever we do. Otherwise, there's no way to build that harmony.
You have listed great energy as one symptom of high achievers.
What did I list as a symptom? High energy, yes. I listed high energy.
High energy as one symptom of great achievers.
Yeah.
But I think that will apply only to business leaders and military leaders and political leaders like that. I don't see how it applies to spiritually great personalities. Many of them, the whole personality is kind of held back. They don't talk much, they don't move much, they kind of sit still for hours. And they are not extroverted like the other business people or military people. The whole personality is self-contained. With such people, do you still apply this rule that these people have great energy?
I think it's a great question, Ashok. But to answer it, I would leave alone the spiritual, which has so many mystical connotations. You take the genius. The genius may be somebody who never talks to another person, sits quietly, reading or studying or just contemplating, and no outward signs of expression of that energy. But because all of the energy is there, intensely focused in an inner mental process. And that's not only the genius, it can be the poet, it can be the musician who's hearing heavenly divine sound and trying to render it on as music. So I think there the energy we're talking about is certainly not physical. It may not be social, it may not express outwardly in human relations, but the description of great spiritual leaders, first of all, many of them have been described as to be in their presence, is to feel a tremendous intensity, even when they're very quiet, just to be in their atmosphere. But other than that, those who are not even relating to other people they have a concentration, a level of intensity of concentration, which is the heart of spiritual practice. And that capacity for intense concentration is itself a powerfully focused, intense energy. So I would agree with you entirely that energy may not be perceptible on the surface, though it often is reported. I have not taken examples, from spiritual traditions of the people's experience of great spiritual leaders, but I think all that I have read confirms this. But even if it's not perceptible outside, doesn't mean it's not there. It means it's turned inside. It's turned towards something else. But the intensity, the capacity for an intense concentration, as you know, to concentrate on anything for more than a few minutes takes a lot of energy. And for somebody who's capable of a great concentration, it means there's a tremendous energy involved. It's a very good question. Okay, was there one more question?
Naveen, what is the highest order of accomplishment for a human personality individual?
Okay, Naveen Madashetty has asked, what is the highest order of accomplishment for human personality and individuality? Human personality and individuality, are they different? Well, it's a good question, Naveen. I think to talk about a highest is to, for each person, there is a highest. I don't think we should talk about, as if there's one for all. But I think the concept of self-actualization, which Alberto was presenting earlier, is, for me, the best conception of the highest. Self-actualization, which means different things for different people, but means the commonality there is discovering and bringing to the fore greater, becoming more aware and more in touch with and more capable of expressing our inner potentials, which are, as he said, essentially unlimited. So that may be in the field of science, it may be in the field of politics, it may be in the field of spirituality or being or of family life. I don't think there's any field that determines it. How far are we really using our enormous potential as human beings? And in the previous, I don't know when you joined our discussions, but I think it's come out well in the first couple of previous 2 days. That society enables us, provides an enabling environment for us to use only a certain portion, I would say relatively small portion, of our human potential. And even when society makes it possible, human beings, we have not been taught, we've not been raised, we've not been cultured to fully discover. And we've not been given the freedom. Even if we have the political freedom, we may not have the social freedom and the intellectual freedom, the psychological freedom to fully discover what that potential is. So I would say that the concept of self-actualization is general enough that it could be applied by anybody in their context, according to their values, their aspirations, their ideals, their capabilities. But it's open to everybody at every level. It's not like only some people can become more self-actualized. I hope that answers your question. Alberto, would you like to reply to that? Because you're...
No, I would like to pose you a question, if it's possible.
Yeah, sure.
As you referred, those humanistic psychologists had in mind the actualizing tendency, a life force that is primary, like a flower or a plant. the primary life forces to have photosynthesis. The so-called evolutionistic psychologists also see human beings having the same, they call it adaptive capacity, the tendency to actualize the potentiality, the evolutionistic, in agreement with also paleontologists, they see it as the main characteristic of our species that abandon the automatic behavior and enter in this, jumping to the unknown, trusting the unknown because it has this urge to learn from experience. A little bit like the mystic jumps into the unknown of what we call the spiritual ocean of melting his or her consciousness, but cannot do without that, because without that it despairs. We as a species, we despair if we don't learn, we need stimulant. A little bit like also the person driven by excellence, obsessed, creative illness it's called. Dedicate yourself unflinching attention. Even in kids, they have unflinching attention. They are, totally obvious, unconscious, fascinated by a toy, by a fable. Now, in terms of what you said, energy, this is, would be seen from humanistic psychology standpoint, evolutionistic psychology, like a change, a dramatic revolution on strategy of survival, from automatic pilot, like other mammalian and other form of life, to consciousness. Consciousness includes, though, feeling aware of death, of finitude, of, anyhow, pain. Not only when you experience pain, but you can envision that you will have pain in the future. So, worry, and so, with this reciprocal, beautiful wanting to learn, also all the neurosis, all the fear, all the despair, the existential angst. Now, you put it very interesting, like, can we talk about energy? But if we talk about energy, it's just one kind of energy, because there are energy currents, in my opinion. It's not just too easy. That would be, one directional with the automatic pilot of instinct that you react to. But to be human is to be afraid. To be human is to have doubt, as you said. To be human is to feel that you are destined not to be, and so forth. I don't know if you have any reaction.
I agree with you that there are many types of energy, and I mentioned at one point a physical energy and a vital or emotional energy, mental energy, psychological or spiritual energy. I would say that the animal is driven, talking about evolution, the animal is driven and more or less determined by the physical biological energy. The human being less so. We are more of a social animal. Our human relations are more important. And as the mind develops, the mind is driving us more and more. I think my reading of the humanistic psychology and self-actualization is there's something, not just mentality, but there's a psychological energy or aspiration or a spiritual energy driven by, characterized by values, characterized by the parameters you were talking about, which is at a deeper and higher level. So for me, evolution is not just an increasing capacity, but an increasing of elevation of these higher level energies, which become more and more determinative in driving the person. We're going to see in the movie example of people who are really just physical in their impulses, people who are very social in their impulses, and people who are driven by a mental goal or a higher value in their, and so to me, the evolution is an evolution that takes us to a deeper, more refined level of inspiration that's driving the personality. I don't know whether that's in any way an answer to what you have in mind.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.